So, in this video lecture, we're going to be taking a look at Russia and specifically the Russian Empire within the context of World War I. Now, for most Americans and pretty much anyone outside of Russia, Russian history seems to be really confusing and kind of mysterious. So, I think it's easiest for us to just understand Russia as it leads to a certain point in history. So, we're basically going to take a look at four things that are going to lead us to better understand where Russia was at the start of World War I. That's going to be its history up until it became an empire, so it's really early history, its culture, or its multiple cultures, its social stratification, or basically the classes within society, and its history of expansion. So, Russia and Russians are Slavic peoples. The first time in history that we can tell that Slavic tribes are really mentioned is at the beginning of the Byzantine Empire. They were in Central Eastern Europe, and by about the 8th and 9th centuries, the Slavic tribes had kind of divided up into multiple tribes, and there was one tribe that started to move east into what is modern Russia. Now, in about the 9th century, there were also throughout history Vikings who were kind of dominating the seas and also the riverways. And Russia is a land of lots of big rivers, and a few Viking leaders, notably a guy named Rurik and his brothers, their names are pretty hard to pronounce, so I won't try. They actually navigated down the rivers into what is now Russia, around a town known as Kiev. So here you've got Rurik and his three brothers meeting these Slavic peoples. So you have Viking leaders who are moving down into Russia to control Slavic peoples. So part of why the Vikings actually wanted this area is because Russia is centrally located between the North Sea, the Black Sea down here, and even the Mediterranean Sea. And there are a couple really big trade routes that the Vikings actually wanted. At this time, the Byzantine Empire was still around and still pretty powerful, and then the Vikings up here were also very powerful. Plus, you have access into other areas like Persia and China if you control Central Asia. Now, these Viking leaders established something known as the Kievan Rus, which was basically the first Russian state. But the Kievan Rus were also overthrown by the Mongols, just like pretty much everybody else in Central Asia. So between 1237 and 1240, the Mongols actually came through and for the most part conquered what we would know as Russia today. But after the Mongols, the Mongol dynasty kind of fell apart, you also have the rise of a new city named Moscow. So here is Moskva, and Kiev was actually a little bit further south. So Moscow used to be just a smaller state within Kiev, or within the Kievan Rus, and Moscow, after the Mongol dynasty collapsed, started to gain more and more power. This power was kind of consolidated, or the power became stronger, once Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, collapsed in 1453. So at this time, Russia's basically best center of command was Moscow, no longer Kievan Rus, or Kiev. Now, the Moscow rulers started to expand their territory throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, and they claimed that they were the rightful heirs of Rurik, that original Viking leader. Now remember, these are Slavic peoples who have a tradition of this Viking leader who isn't exactly Slavic. Ivan the Great was the first real Tsar. Now you might have heard this word Tsar. You've also maybe seen it spelled Tzar or Czar. But Ivan the Great basically considered himself the new Caesar. So Rome fell, that was the first Rome. The Byzantine Empire fell, that was the second Rome. And Ivan the Great basically considered Russia the next incarnation of the Roman Empire. So Tsar actually means Caesar. Ivan the Great is going to establish a new dynasty of rulers known as the Romanov dynasty, which you'll see this word around a lot. Now, part of why I'm telling you this history is because it helps us to understand how Russia has a history of authoritarian rule. So, Ivan III, also known as Ivan the Great, he might be considered the first Tsar, but Ivan IV, sometimes known as Ivan the Terrible, is really the first guy who consolidates rule within Russia and rule from one place, which is Moscow. The story goes that he used to be he assumed the throne when he was like 16 years old, um, because of maybe his wife who died or somebody who basically caused tragedy in his life early on, may have made this guy into kind of a jerk or at least a scary person. Um, there's also been some problems with translation of his nickname. Some people think he was Ivan the Fearful or something other than the Terrible. But this really shows us two things. First of all, Americans love to romanticize how just scary Russian leaders can be. And so Ivan the Terrible, as you can see from his painting here, seems to be some kind of a maniac who just rules with an iron fist. But another thing that this shows is that Russians tend to have an authoritarian central ruler. So the story goes that at some point Ivan the Terrible abdicated the throne, possibly because he was so sad about his wife dying. And what happened is that war broke out between all these rival Russian warlords. So at some point they begged him to come back, and he did, and he established central rule. And from that point forward, it was pretty much assumed that Russia needed a strong authoritarian ruler, somebody who made all the decisions for the most part, and somebody who kept an iron fist over the empire. Now, let's keep going with culture here. After the Byzantine Empire fell, it was pretty much seen that the last stronghold of the Eastern Orthodox Church was Russia. So, Kievan Rus, that first Russian state, became Christian in 988 under a guy named Vladimir the Great. Now, after the Great Schism, in which you divide between Catholic and Eastern Orthodox, Russia went Eastern Orthodox. If you need a little bit more help with understanding what the Great Schism is, let me know. But for the most part, just keep in mind that the church pretty much divided into two branches, and Russia took the eastern branch. Another important cultural concept is this idea of pan-Slavism. So Russia and most of the Russian people are Slavic. In 1914, Russia was the most powerful Slavic nation. Now we learned that actually the first rulers of the Russian state were Viking, but the vast majority of Russian people are Slavic. Today, for instance, Russia has about 3/7 of all the Slavic people in the world. So in 1914, Russia was seen as kind of like the big daddy of all the Slavic peoples. So there was something known as a pan-nationalist movement, which was pan-Slavic, which meant Russia was trying to unite all the Slavic peoples or at least get them to have alliances. So Russia had alliances with places like Serbia. But another important thing to keep in mind is that Russia is a big, big empire. And we'll see why from its expansion, but there were lots and lots of different kinds of people within the Russian Empire. Here's a map from 1914. It's a French map, so you can't really read all of it. But you have Russians, Lithuanians, Poles, Finnish, and then you also have Mongols who were Muslim. So this is not just a Slavic empire. It's actually a multi-ethnic empire. Now, a couple other things. The way society was broken down in Russia was basically nobility, clergy, urban people, and rural people. This was actually proclaimed in about 1813 or 1830 by the Tsar. Here, actually, you've got a different spelling of Tsar. And this was supposed to help preserve Russian society. Now, urban people was starting to grow and grow throughout the 19th century, especially with the Industrial Revolution. But rural people, which made up the vast majority of the population, was basically either a serf or a peasant or a noble landowner. Now, within rural Russia, until about 1861, all peasants were basically serfs, which for lack of a better word was a slave. They had no control over what they were able to do. They had to work the land for their noble landowners. And the reason peasants did this is kind of debated. It's hard for Americans to understand, but when we get into Russian geography, you'll see why peasants basically decided they should stay and work as serfs. But by the 1890s, the Russian Industrial Revolution was taking place. It was a little bit later than places like Britain and the United States and Germany, but this was the first real alternative to Russians who wanted to basically leave their rural lands. So here you've got a painting of actually the 1861 emancipation of the serfs, and the Tsar made this big declaration, actually just 4 years before slaves in the United States were emancipated.